Hey everybody, welcome to another Cordial Curiosity live stream. Today I've got Dean Meadows with me. He is an apologist, I believe, from I met him on Facebook. I think
Yeah,
he
out of
commented
North
on one of
Carolina.
them. Yeah, Apologia.
Yeah.
Yeah, so cool. Yeah, Dean, just want to give a little bit of background so people know who you are.
Yeah. I was in the Marine Corps for 6 years. And then at that time, I went out to Denver, out to the Bear Valley Bible Institute. Went from there, came to North Carolina for to preach the gospel. And then I'm at Biola University right now. So that's kind of just the rough background.
Cool. Biola University. What are you studying now?
Master's in Apologetics is the program that we're in,
Oh, cool.
or that I'm in, excuse me, not we.
Cool. So this should be a lot of fun. All right. And great. So today we'll just probably just chat a little bit, maybe half an hour or an hour about some reasons to believe in this God uh, idea. And I get, yeah, you're a Christian, any
Yeah.
particular kind of Christian?
Uh, I just simply say Christian, New Testament Christian. That's just kind of my mantra. So
Okay. Sweet. So yeah, you've seen a couple of my videos. I do this thing,
yeah,
called Street Epistemology, and
and I
just basically,
appreciate you reaching out by the way, on
but
the Facebook page.
yeah, yeah, it's just a more friendly way to chat with people about these types of things, like deeply held beliefs, gods, and other
Yeah,
things.
no doubt.
So I would just, my goal today is just to kind of understand your reasons why as best as possible,
Yeah,
and
no doubt.
maybe allow create an opportunity to reflect on those reasons. You know, but I really want to understand you as clearly as possible. So I'll try to
Yeah,
do
no
that.
problem. No problem.
Great. Um, so maybe first, can I get a sense of your confidence that a God is real and true, say on a scale
Well,
from 0 to 100?
you know,
Where would you
I
put yourself?
well, I mean, I think it's personally, I think it's kind of hard to specifically put a number on that because there are different ways I think you can arrive at something is true. I mean, I'd say I would strongly believe or firmly believe that God exists. Um, but I don't necessarily know. I don't necessarily know. It seems to me that I guess I don't understand the nature of the question. I don't necessarily know
Yeah,
what the
what I try to understand from the question is mainly if someone says they're 100% about something, then I would ask a follow-up question. Could you could they be mistaken about that belief? Like, could they be, yeah, could that belief
yeah.
be inaccurate?
Yeah. So I guess the only way that I would answer that is that I believe that God exists, beyond like a reasonable doubt, so to speak. And whatever that's on the scale, then I guess I'd put that on the scale. I mean, if that's a 95%, then that's a 95%. If that's beyond reasonable doubt is if beyond reasonable doubt is 51% on the scale, or if reasonable doubt is 80% on the scale, then that's I think where I
Mhm.
would be with regards to the existence of God.
I'd say, yeah, around 99% or so would be probably beyond a reasonable doubt. Like, I'm beyond a reasonable doubt that this is going to fall when I drop it, that type of thing. Uh,
I mean,
Stuff like that.
and I guess I just struggle with with the question because it seems like and I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into the question. I definitely
Yeah.
could be. I guess it seems like
Yeah.
the scale, seems. I mean,
Yeah.
scale seems
I
arbitrary.
usually ask it for people who I don't really know,
Okay.
like anything at all about their background. So I guess
Yeah.
since you're an apologist, I should assume that, you're pretty much beyond a reasonable doubt. But some people say like 60% or
Yeah.
70%.
Okay.
And and those kind of conversations differ a little bit. So
Okay.
I could probably skip the confidence question when talking to apologists, and just yeah. So beyond a reasonable doubt, that's fine. Great. So, and then I also just like to ask, what is the main reason why? What gets you to such high confidence?
I think there are a couple of reasons that give me a confidence that God exists. One, um, I think the classic Kalam cosmological argument is a good philosophical argument for the existence of God. I think the historical nature of the resurrection is, um, I think the historical nature of the resurrection is also beyond the reasonable doubt. I think that's probably as solid a historical event as, say, something like um, the existence of Alexander the Great, or the existence of Julius Caesar, or the existence of Socrates, so to speak.
Gotcha. So one type of argument is the Kalam cosmological argument, and also just the basic, historical nature of the resurrection. Those
Yeah,
two main reasons.
those are pretty much two of my main reasons. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm not saying this is the case, but if both of those reasons were found to be kind of insufficient reasons, like unreliable ways to come to this belief, if you found out to your satisfaction, where would your confidence be in terms of this belief, you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, if it could be shown with, beyond a reasonable doubt that, say, something like the resurrection is not a historical event, then, I think, just in the same way is with those other examples, if it could be shown with beyond a reasonable doubt that um, Alexander the Great, didn't exist, or that Socrates didn't exist, um, or George Washington didn't cross the Delaware. If it could be shown beyond a reasonable doubt that those characters or events didn't happen, then obviously I think people's confidence in those historical events would be changed, and I think they should be changed. I mean,
Okay.
so yeah.
So you would lower your confidence in at least in some way about this if you found out those reasons were unreliable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be the appropriate response. If there, I mean, and I don't want to belabor the point, but if, like, we found out tomorrow that 2 + 2 wasn't actually 4, I mean, I don't think
Yeah.
anybody would walk around and still say that 2 + 2 is 4. If it was
Right.
5, if 2 + 2 is actually 5, it wouldn't make any sense to walk around and say that 2 + 2 is 4.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that might be a not a very good analogy, but that's just kind of where I am.
Okay. So great. Which one do you want to talk about? We could probably talk about the historical nature of the resurrection a little bit, since
Okay, sure.
that seems to be something that gives you a lot of confidence about it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm more interested in like the extraordinary level of this event. Like, it seems to be like the resurrection, like of someone who died, is
Hmm.
pretty incredible. Um, and it seems to be kind of a different type of claim or belief than Alexander the Great being alive and doing what he did,
Hmm.
and also people crossing the Delaware, and just other people
Yeah.
just being alive.
Yeah.
It's the coming back from the dead part that seems uh, interesting.
No, it certainly is, and I think when you look at any historical event, whether that's um, Washington crossing the Delaware, the existence of Alexander the Great, the existence of Caesar, the resurrection, I think you have to take those on a case by case basis, and you have to ask the question: okay, do we have any eyewitnesses to those accounts, and how reliable are those eyewitnesses? I think the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I think that those are credible, reliable eyewitnesses to the life and death and resurrection of Christ.
Okay. I'm not very clear on the specifics in the Bible. Like, how many, like, give a rough estimate, or like how many eyewitnesses saw this thing happening?
Yeah, so you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who are the writers of it. You
Yeah.
have of those, four accounts. You've got, um, let's see, 11 disciples. There's even a quote from Paul in First Corinthians, I believe it's 15, um, that probably dates early 30s AD, 33, 35. I think it's between 33 to 37 AD, in which it states that the disciples saw it. You had 500 eyewitnesses that saw it as well. You have James, his brother, who ends up being a leader in the church, who at first wasn't a skeptic, or I mean, it's not a skeptic, who wasn't a believer, was a skeptic, and
Hmm.
then becomes a believer. So, roughly 500 witnesses plus the disciples, and at least two gentlemen on the road to.
Was there anybody who was like there in person and wrote down stuff about it?
What do you mean?
Like, is there anybody who saw Jesus come back from the dead in person, first person, and then wrote down their
First,
account of it? Yeah.
yeah, no, you have the disciples who interacted with the resurrected Jesus. I mean, they claimed that they saw the resurrected Jesus. I mean, you would have, um, the 500 eyewitnesses that were there, or not there specifically at the tomb, but who interacted, who claimed that they saw the resurrected Jesus. So, I mean, I think with Matthew, Mark, and John, you have disciples of Jesus who interacted with Jesus and wrote those things down.
So at least three people were there
Mhm.
and saw it with their own eyes, and then wrote down stuff about
Yeah,
it.
there were three people that interacted with the resurrected Jesus and wrote down the account of Jesus' life, including his resurrection.
Okay. And yeah, forgive me for being so ignorant about the Bible. Like, how long after the event did they write it down?
Um, let's see. So, you have Mark is usually dated at 50 AD. You have John who's rated at 90 AD, I forgive me, I don't know the specifics. I think you have Matthew around. Um, I think you have Matthew around 60s AD. I'm not sure the definite date, but you have 50 AD, around 70s AD, and then you have um, John at 90 AD.
Okay. And the event itself happened around like 30 something,
33 AD. Yeah.
33.
Yeah.
So around like 20 years later, um, someone wrote down stuff about it. And then
Yeah.
like a decade after that, someone else wrote something down about it.
Well, yeah, you would have John probably latest the four gospels around 90 AD.
Okay. So these few people who were actually there, how old were they when they wrote it down? How old were they when they saw it? And then how old were
Well,
they when they
to
wrote it
the,
down?
to the nature of um, Matthew and Mark, I am not sure. John is older. John's he ends up being he's at Patmos. He's exiled at Patmos when he writes, and it's noted that he's an older gentleman. So,
Okay. Okay. So these few people um, claimed they were there and they saw this resurrection happen,
yeah.
and then they wrote it down sometime afterwards. Is this like this seems like the highest quality evidence, being firsthand accounts from themselves. Is having firsthand accounts of this kind a reliable way to know this is actually true?
Well, I think, in any given situation, whether it's, this or, a murder that takes out on the street, I think eyewitness testimony has to be taken into consideration, on a case by case basis. I mean, there are instances where, people uh, are asked to come and testify, and in the matter of, seconds or moments, they don't know whether the person, had a gun or, had a knife, or whether or not they, were assaulted with brass knuckles or just with a regular fist. So, I mean, I think eyewitness testimony has to be taken into account on a step by step basis, or not step by step, a case by case basis, and deciphered based on who you're dealing with.
Okay, so I'm hearing you say it's like a case by case basis,
Yeah,
and that it just depends on the circumstances and how they were there and
yeah,
all that.
yeah.
Okay. Let me think. So yeah, can we just talk about the quality of eyewitness testimony?
Yeah, sure.
And like what's the limit of eyewitness testimony as evidence? So we have like three
What do you mean?
people.
I don't necessarily know if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yeah, let me try and explain. I'm trying to understand, like, if three people knocked on my door right now, and said they saw someone come back from the dead, like they're alive eyewitnesses, would I be justified to believe them?
Well, that depends on what evidence that they would present. How reliable are those witnesses? You have to take. I mean, in any situation in which you talk about a resurrection, I think you have to look at the reliability of those witnesses, and I think you have substantial historical evidence with regards to the New Testament documents that would point to them being reliable, ancient documents that are historical. I mean, in the same way that we would say, like I said before, like Alexander the Great would be his biography. Most people, a lot of scholars take his biography to be historical. And let me just finish this thought. And so most people accept, Plutarch's biography of Alexander the Great. And you mentioned earlier the idea that they wrote decades after. Well, Alexander the Great's biography by Plutarch isn't written until 400 years after his existence, but people would still say that that's historical. Same thing with Julius Caesar.
Yeah, is there anything special about Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar that's comparable to someone coming back from the dead?
Yeah. No, my point in saying that is that regardless of the claim, the issue is, is this a historical event that took place, regardless of what the claim might be. So if the claim is Jesus rose from the dead, or Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or, and I'm making a hypothetical claim about, or Alexander the Great did A, B, C, or D. The question in hand is not whether or not Alexander the Great's biography is comparable to Jesus coming back from the dead. The question is there good historical evidence for Alexander the Great being a person, and is there good historical evidence for the resurrection? And so if there's good historical evidence for the resurrection, and if there's good historical evidence for Alexander the Great, then I think it's the obligation of the person seeking or looking at that evidence to come to the determination that it's historical.
So what I'm hearing you say is, as long as it's historical, as long as like the standards of historical methods, however they come out about those, as long as those are good, we're justified in believing anything?
Well,
what's the limit?
Yeah. So, for instance, if you have good, reliable evidence, say you mentioned eyewitnesses earlier. if you have good eyewitness testimony, and you can see in the ancient documents. So, for instance, let's go with something like the myth of Osiris, right? That's ancient, right? That's a Near East religion, but there's no good historical evidence uh, that Osiris, as a Egyptian god, ever existed as a person. Or maybe more comparable to Jesus might be Hercules. There's no good historical evidence that Hercules, as portrayed in the Greek mythologies, ever existed. There's no
Yep.
eyewitness testimony to his existence.
Okay.
The stories and themes are very general. They don't necessarily open up the documents to being scrutinized. Whereas when we look at the gospel accounts, something like Luke, for instance, in chapter 3 in Luke, he names specific people, places, and a time frame for those things to happen. So if I'm a historian, as I look at the case for Hercules, or if I look at the case for Alexander, if I look at the case for um, the Gospels, what I have to ask is, okay, are these things structured in a way that there's no way to examine whether that's historical? Is there embarrassing material that's that's in those documents? Because if there's embarrassing material, most likely they wouldn't have made that up. I mean, nobody puts on Facebook, right? Hey, I did this stupid thing today, to make themselves look like an idiot if they're trying to build a brand or build a case, right? So I think that's a way to test historicity, to test whether or not a document is reliable. Certainly, the idea that, oh well, hey, just because it's ancient history, just because people, not ancient history, but just because it's back here in a certain time frame, doesn't necessarily make it. I think you would agree with this. Doesn't necessarily make it true.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say is there's different ways to like test the reliability of historical claims, stuff
Yeah,
like
yeah, no doubt.
a person naming specific people and places that can be verified in other ways,
Yeah,
and finding other things like if someone wrote about some embarrassing stuff about themselves,
yeah,
it's not likely they would do that if they were trying to uh, you know lie about it, or
yeah,
they would have no reason to do that.
yeah.
Okay, so it seems like there's a difference between like the quantity and quality of the evidence for this claim about Jesus's resurrection.
Yeah, I would say that I mean, I would say that there are at least, three minimal facts that 90% of scholars, agree with, that are historical about the gospel accounts. At least three, ninety
Yeah.
percent agree with. And I think from
So
those three, you could build a case for the resurrection historically.
okay, maybe let's try and imagine something. Say we have like the same quality and quantity of evidence um, as we do for this resurrection claim. What would we be not justified to believe based on the same kinds of evidence?
Well, I mean, you'd have to give me a actual scenario that in which we do have something, this type of quality and quantity claim for the resurrection. I mean, you'd have to give me something. You'd have to give me an ancient document that be, comparable
I'm
to
just
some.
trying to think hypothetically, kind of more abstractly. Um, like we have these kinds of evidence, like eyewitness testimony and other things. Um, what would we be not justified to believe based on these kind of evidence? Is there anything?
I don't necessarily know if I'm understanding the question fully. So hypothetically,
Yeah,
if we had the same type of evidence for somebody coming back from the dead.
or some other extraordinary claim, like what's an extraordinary claim that we would be not justified to believe based on the kinds of evidence that justifies the resurrection.
The same kinds of evidence that justifies the resurrection. Um, I still don't necessarily know that I'm following the question. I mean, if you had um,
Like
reliable,
what's something you don't believe to be true that's kind of similar in quality in like the extraordinariness of someone coming back to the dead?
what's something that I don't believe that is similar to the
Yeah.
resurrection?
Yeah. Something you don't believe to be true that's also extraordinary, like someone coming back from the dead.
Something I don't believe to be true that is like someone coming back from the dead. Um, I do not believe. Um, I'm just thinking hypothetically. I do not believe in. I don't believe in pink and purple polka dotted unicorns. How's that?
Gotcha. Great. So, yes, if we had like similar kinds of evidence about someone claiming that a pink, whatever, polka dotted unicorn existed, we would not be justified. Would we be justified to believe
Would we be
in that?
justified to believe that?
Yeah. Or
Well,
would
I
we?
mean, I think the reason for the resurrection, I think the why the resurrection would be historical is because of the evidence. Now, if we went around and we said there's no such thing as a pink purple polka dotted unicorn, and then there was evidence that suggested that it did actually exist, then obviously, we would have to. I think we would have to take that into consideration. I mean, in the same way,
Mhm.
there's a time in human history where we thought that the sun rotated around the Earth, right?
Yeah.
And as there was evidence, that was a extraordinary claim. And then along came who was it? Galileo, I believe. Was it Galileo or
I think
Kepler?
so. Yeah.
Galileo.
Mhm.
Galileo that said actually it's us that rotates around the sun. That was an extraordinary claim, right? And
Mhm.
so as the evidence came in, then the paradigm shifted. So if something like that were to take place with a pink, what did I say, pink purple polka dotted unicorn, and I think you'd have to take that evidence into consideration. For sure. No, regardless, evidence I think speaks for itself.
The evidence speaks for itself.
Yeah, I think evidence speaks for itself. No
Mhm.
matter, I mean, regardless of what the nature of the claim might be, if there's substantial evidence that would ever point to a pink purple polka dotted unicorn, then I think we would have to take that, at face value. At present, I mean, I know we're talking hypothetical, but at present, there isn't any.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if we had like similar, pretty much the similar quality and quantity of evidence that we have for the resurrection, if we had that for a pink, purple, polka dotted unicorn, would we be justified to believe that exists
I mean, I guess my
to the same degree of confidence as
yeah,
we do about the?
I guess my question would be why if we had the same degree of evidence, why wouldn't we accept it?
Good question. Would probably doubt it just the same. I would need more evidence uh, for something like that because we don't really observe that happening a lot. A lot. Um,
Well, I think, to that standard, I think there are a lot of things that we don't necessarily uh I don't necessarily know there's a lot of things that we can necessarily empirically prove, but we're reasonable to accept. So for instance, you're right, I never witnessed Jesus come back from the dead, but I've also, in Newton's, theory of general relativity, the speed of light is assumed that it travels the same speed from one distance to another that you can't test empirically, but we're all rational, uh, to accept. Or for instance,
you
I
mean
can't hear it.
Einstein's general relativity?
Yeah. So for instance, maybe another case in point would be, so for instance, using a scientific method I can't access the laws of logic, but I'm perfectly rational to accept that those things exist. So while I may not be able to empirically, personally observe the resurrection that took place 2,000 years ago, I am rational to accept it on the basis of the evidence that's used to judge those documents. That's the same standard that's used to judge any other historical document of ancient time. I can't
You'd be
throw out.
rational to do that?
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that you can throw out um, that you can throw out uh, something being historical, either one because you weren't there to see it, uh, or because it doesn't necessarily happen uh, now, or because
Okay.
it's old.
What would be like the minimum amount of evidence that you would consider um, to be rational or reasonable to believe in something like someone coming back from the dead?
The the minimal
Minimum, yeah. What's the minimum?
the minimum amount of evidence that would be needed to um I think when you look at something like someone being raised from the dead, I think there's the explanatory scope of the evidence. Anything that would either prove or let's go this way, whatever is going to replace the resurrection narrative would have to be able to have the explanatory scope um, that deals with things like the growth of Christianity. So, for instance, let me give you a hypothetical. Um, so, in dealing with the evidence, there's a theory out there called swoon theory, right? That Jesus really didn't die.
Well, I'm kind of asking more abstractly again, like regardless of Christianity, just for you personally,
Hmm.
um, like would one eyewitness not be enough?
Would one eyewitness not be enough? No, I think you have to. I think you have to have a substantial amount of. Um, it depends on the reliability of that eyewitness. I mean,
Okay.
what's the nature of the eyewitness? Has the eyewitness ever been known to lie? Has the eyewitness ever been known to be untrustworthy?
Yeah.
Um,
Who's the most
I
reliable
think that
person you know?
so I think that is something um, that has to be taken into account when you're talking about eyewitness testimony for something like the resurrection. See, um, which I think is interesting about the resurrection because it's not just um, one person or it's not just one document, but it's
Okay.
four independent sources of history that document that.
Okay. Who is like someone that you trust the most today?
What I trust the most today, um, someone I trust the most. My wife's not going to see this, right?
I don't know.
No. Um, no, I mean I would trust
You don't have to say their name, or just you can just have
no,
someone in mind.
no, I have somebody in mind, the most reliable person that I trust. All right.
Okay. Is there anything that person could say that you would not believe to be true?
Sure.
Okay. And um, how many of these types of people would it take for you to like to be justified to believe in someone coming back from the dead? Is it just if that person said that, would you be justified? If not, how many of people like similar to them?
Well, no, I think it would have to take kind of the course of what we see in the Gospels. I mean, I think you'd have to have uh, a number of uh, eyewitnesses. I think you'd have to have a number of reliable
Mhm.
sources as well. I mean, even if it's just one person or 50 people or 500 people said that they saw somebody come back from the dead. I see. As a Christian, I don't necessarily have a problem with with miracles taking place. I don't have a problem with miracles taking place in the
Okay.
gospel. I don't have a problem with that.
I'm still trying to understand this trustworthy person, if they claim that they saw someone come back from the dead, would you be justified to believe them?
Well, it depends on what their story would say. I mean, the question is, how close were they to the event? Did they learn it secondhand? Did they learn it third hand? I mean, you can,
If they were there the entire time,
if
I
they
don't
were,
know.
yeah, no, if they were there the entire time, uh, and it's, it's something that's very, 1 second, let me get my charger. I'm at 10%.
Sure.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
All right. There you go. Okay. So what was the question?
So you have a trustworthy person in mind,
Mm-hmm.
and if they claim that they saw someone come back from the dead, and the circumstances that allowed them to say that were to your satisfaction, I don't know, good, would you be justified to believe them?
Given the near-death experiences or accounts that we have, I don't necessarily know why I wouldn't be justified to believe them. I mean, if it's good evidence for that, then sure, I would believe them. In the same way that I would believe the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay. And is there anything, there is something that they could say that you would not be justified to believe?
Oh yeah, sure. No doubt. I mean, there's definitely things that they could say that I wouldn't be justified to believe. Like if they came to me and said 2 + 2 is 5, I would not be justified in believing that that's true. If they came to me and said, Abraham Lincoln is not a person of history, when in fact the evidence shows that Abraham Lincoln is a person of history, I think that that would be a justifiable reason not to believe them.
Yeah, and I'm struggling to understand how 2 + 2 + 5, 2 + 2 equals 5 is like different in any qualitative way from someone coming back from the dead.
Yeah, no. So when it comes to Jesus and when it comes to the mathematical situation, I think they're different ways or different sets or types of truth, right? So there's historical truth, there's moral truth, and each of these, right? I think we would agree that each of these may have a different standard for how to access that truth. So mathematical truths or logical truths would be different in establishing a logical truth, and a mathematical truth would be completely different than establishing a historical truth, right? Like the resurrection.
Okay. Are historical truths any different from like just regular everyday truths? Like
The way,
stuff
no,
you
I'm
can
not
figure
saying that.
out
I'm saying the
scientifically?
way in which those truths are accessed might be different, right? Because in a historical truth, I'm not, say, present when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. I'm not present there. Whereas, whereas I can look at those documents and I can look at the historical record and say, okay, did this take place on the basis of the documents that I have? Whereas, something like the resurrection of Jesus as a historical truth, I think is just as reliable as say Caesar crossing the Rubicon, because what you have in those documents are embarrassing information, right? Jesus calls Peter Satan. You have women who discovered the tomb first. You've got situations where the disciples don't understand what Jesus is saying. And so all of those things are what we call in historical terms articles of embarrassment that are included, but don't necessarily help the case, right? So if a document has embarrassing information in it, and an ancient document has embarrassing information in it, then it's most likely that those people were telling the truth. So, for instance, another instance would be the tomb that Jesus was buried in was owned by Joseph of Arimathea, who's a member of the Sanhedrin Council, which is vehemently against Jesus and his ministry. So it's the nature of it's the accessing of the truth that might be different. The way in which I, either discover or come to a moral truth might be different than that of historical truth.
All right.
That makes sense. If I need to clarify, I'll try and clarify.
I think I understand it. Yeah, it's about different kinds of evidence, and different ways of seeing that evidence based on different factors. I'm still trying to understand how I don't, for myself, I just don't want to be fooled. And the quality and quantity of evidence I see for this claim is nowhere near, for me, to being close to being justified. And I may be wrong about that. I just really struggle to see how it could be at all close to being justified.
Okay. Well, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So, my first question would be, why what makes you make that statement? Why do you say that it's not justified in being believed or being historical?
Like the similar things about, Alexander the Great and all of that. Like, I have no problem accepting stuff like that happened. Like a person was alive. Like, people are alive all around me. That doesn't seem very special. If Alexander the Great was claimed to be coming back from the dead, then I would still be skeptical. I would question that, because I don't see people coming back from the dead around me, like, at all. We've never seen that, like, under controlled testing conditions. I would love to believe that if that's true.
Yeah.
I just really struggle to understand how that could be the case.
So let me ask a follow-up question, if that's okay.
Sure.
If I were to, if you could describe your worldview, what would that worldview be?
In terms of just general worldview?
Yeah, like general worldview. Yeah.
I don't believe in the supernatural, if that's what you're asking, because I have no way of determining if that is real, as far as I know.
So you then how do you? I guess my question would be then how do you justify what is a true claim, something that's justified to believe? How do you access that?
In terms of, like, people coming back from the dead, some
No,
type of evidence.
just in general. Like, if you, so I guess my question is, how do you know that? So I guess my question is, would you say that you're a empiricist? You follow empiricism, that the only thing, or I mean, is it empiricism? Is it naturalism? Is it, I mean,
I'd say methodological
what's
naturalism.
your do what?
Methodological naturalism. I think that's what it's called.
Okay. So methodological naturalism. So then in arriving at truth, right, for the way in which the world works, if I understand your worldview correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, then you would say the only thing that is true is that which takes place and can be observed in nature.
I think that's philosophical naturalism. Like there's a different,
Like scientific method then
yeah,
has to be able to be
like
tested.
the supernatural could be true. I just don't see how we could determine it to be true. Like as far as we can get is like, huh, that's funny with science. Like we can do experiments and just not understand how results come about.
Mm-hmm.
Like positing a supernatural explanation
Yeah.
seems to have a bad track record across time.
Okay.
Like throughout history,
Okay.
like every mystery ever solved has turned out to be not magic.
Yeah.
That type of thing.
Yeah. No, and I don't necessarily know that I ascribe to the uh, oh wow, wait, that's magic. I don't necessarily know any, not any. I mean, certainly, I think that that's a bad route for Christians to take, is to say because we can't explain it, it must be God. I don't think that's necessarily a good route. So let me ask you this,
Mhm.
with regards to the resurrection. What evidence? So let me pose this scenario to you. So let's say you and I are talking right now,
Sure.
right? Which we are, and then someone walks in from the door, and then you see me get my head cut off
Mm.
on the live stream, and everybody out there in the live stream does too,
Yeah,
right? And so you see it, you shut it off, and then uh, 3 days later, right? I type, you get a Facebook message from me. It says, "Hey, I can continue the interview," right?
Hmm.
And then we're back on TV with, I have the scar on my neck, this, that, and the other. Would you say then that uh, a uh, um, a miracle happened, or that something supernatural took place? Would you say that, hey, he's back from the dead?
I love that question. If that happened, I would say no, that nothing supernatural happened.
Okay.
This
So then,
evidence, this
so
this kind of evidence, not to be sufficient for that.
so yeah. So in that hypothetical situation, then you're automatically, your epistemology starts with, it's not that the supernatural isn't possible, but the supernatural is automatically nixed out.
Before I even got to like anything weird or supernatural, I would have to rule out a bunch of other things. Like, do you have a twin brother? Are you a really good special effects artist? Was this kind of pre-recorded? Are you doing other things? Like there's a ton of things that could have happened that even don't even touch supernatural types of explanations.
So then, what evidence would you need as a methodological naturalist for to believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Because I mean, there are historical events. I think you and I would agree.
Of something happening in the past, like 2,000 years ago type of thing, or just
Yeah,
like someone coming back from the dead today.
or like in the case of Jesus, in the case of the claim that Christians make that Jesus came back from the dead, what evidence would you need for that to be, for you to come to the understanding that, okay, that is a historical event in the same way that Caesar crossing the Rubicon is a historical event?
Yeah, it would have to be something like a time machine. I'd have to go back and we'd have to test it there actually happening.
Okay.
And like,
So then my next question is would be so if that is that the only way that you so that's the only way that you would ever say, hey, the resurrection of Jesus took place, is a time machine.
it would be the most reliable way that I could think of.
Well,
And even if I went by myself in a time machine and saw it with
yeah,
my own eyes, I'd still be skeptical.
okay.
I would like to have like a team of people
A team of people,
coming back.
like you and me go back in a time machine and we go and
Yeah.
we observe it. Would that be enough if it was just you and me?
You and me and you.
Yeah.
It'd be very close. My confidence would be raised a lot,
Okay. Yeah.
like very high.
Yeah.
I would not
So
be 100%. I would probably not be 90%, but I would be around 80 to 90%.
gotcha. So then my next question would be, so in the instance of that historical event, you would need a time machine.
Mhm.
But in other historical events, you don't necessarily you would necessarily need a time machine.
No, because they seem to be claims of like stuff we could expect to happen, naturally. Just regular old people being alive, doing human stuff.
Okay. So like would you say that so your epistemology then rules out anything supernatural taking place, the possibility of any supernatural thing taking place?
Um, Currently, because I currently don't understand how I could know, how I could determine that anything supernatural. As far as I could get was I don't know, or this seems funny.
Or
Eh,
this seems fun. Gotcha.
Yeah,
Um,
that
okay. That's interesting. Um, so if methodological naturalism is a justified belief, then how do you access things like uh, the laws of logic? So
they're
it's
like one of those brute facts type of things. They're just I kind of just assume them to be like part of the nature of the universe. I could be wrong about that. Uh, I don't know them to be that to 100% confidence, but it's just an assumption.
so,
I could be wrong.
so let me ask you this: is that um, and I don't want to be too. I hope the next statement isn't offensive. I'm not
Sure.
trying to offend, but wouldn't that be a type of faith claim to say that, well, I don't know, but it's a brute fact, or um, in that age? I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have a a per the scientific method. You couldn't access those logical truths, and so it's a brute fact, is what you're saying,
Yeah,
right?
like a presupposition, brute fact,
Yeah.
assumption.
Okay.
Um, yeah, and it's about I don't hold beliefs to 100% confidence. They're useful, that assumption, and they're also I use Occam's razor to get to them. Like I don't add any other assumptions. I don't add like a magic.
Unnecessary.
Yeah, I don't have like laws of logic plus magic makes them work. They're just there.
Yeah.
Um, so
Okay.
we're
That's
kind of
interesting.
stuck. Yeah,
Um, I can go a little bit longer, and I really am enjoying the conversation.
sure.
Sure. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to go maybe if you
Yeah,
have time. You got 10 minutes or 15 minutes?
totally. Yeah, I'm an open book.
Do what?
I'm an open book. You can ask
Okay.
me anything, or I could
Cool deal.
also keep
Um,
keep asking
yeah.
questions.
So, with regards, to that, well, I guess my question is, what about the New Testament documents, or even, the empty tomb of Jesus? Let's start with, let's go with the empty tomb.
Mhm.
The question that I would ask is, you know, how would you how would you adequately um, how'd you adequately explain the empty tomb that's recorded in the Gospels?
How could I explain that story?
Not necessarily
Um,
story, but I mean,
that
there
claim?
are, I mean, 75, I think it's, what is it? Habermas and Lacona put a book out several years ago and listed like 12 minimal facts about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I think it's like 75% of scholars said that it's a historical fact that the women found the tomb empty on the third day. Not that that proves the resurrection. That doesn't prove the resurrection. But my question is, if if the resurrection didn't happen, then how would you explain the nature of the empty tomb, and how would you explain the nature of the shift seen in the disciples, the conversion of James, or the conversion of Paul?
Mythology.
Mythology.
Yeah.
Okay, elaborate on that.
It's a story. Like I see the Gospels as a story, like a kind of mythology. It uses the character of Jesus as like a passion play. It's a morality tale. The Old Testament was about. I can go into it if you want.
No, go ahead.
Quick.
Go ahead.
Yeah, like the Old Testament was about trying to figure out the most optimum state structure. So it's like story after story. I think it's like 6 or 7 stories of like, well, if the state isn't this way, it'll get corrupted into chaos, and then people will suffer. And that just happens over and over again in the Old Testament. So people are trying to figure out with these stories over a long time, and the Old Testament was an amalgamation of all these stories. And that allowed people to, like, people who couldn't read or write, to be able to like have these values in their culture, and a community with all of these values together could be able to thrive and outcompete other tribes. So it's like altruistic groups outcompete individualistic, selfish groups. And these religious stories allow people to bind together into a tribe and like circle around these values that these stories portrayed. So people who believe the stories were in a tribe that outcompeted other tribes, and eventually all those stories got remixed together, and that's the Old Testament. And it demonstrates how the tribes themselves, how the state, or cities or
so
work.
What about the specifically? You said that you see the resurrection as a story or a mythology.
Yeah.
So
the New Testament is different. I can explain.
Yeah, go ahead. Because I'm interested to see how you connect the mythology to the resurrection of Jesus.
Sure. Like I could be totally wrong about this, but this is just how I see it.
No, that's fine.
So the Old Testament is about trying to find a solution to chaos, trying to figure out how to have stable societies. And the Old Testament was about trying to get the state right, but the New Testament was different. It was about trying to get, like, we figured out this, trying to get the state perfect is not going to work. It has to be the individual person get that right, and the state will take care of itself. So the passion play is about the value of the individual. Jesus represents the highest value. He's a character that takes upon like the whole sins of the world on himself. Like it's like the ultimate sacrifice.
Yeah.
And so we kind of have to think of ourselves like that. It's the individual. It's like the one person, Jesus. Individual has the most moral value. Like that wasn't a thing all the time. Like that came about through all these stories and all that.
So I guess my question is, I guess my follow-up question would be, where do we see that type of connection, in the history of Christianity, that this is the nature and essence and purpose of the Gospels? Where do we see the connection between Jesus being a mythology? Because and the only reason I ask is because the nature of the mythologies that are in ancient Near East are radically, totally differently structured than the than the Gospels. I mean, because you
Yeah,
have a gospel narrative is its own genre, and mythology is its own genre. And what I'm trying to get to is, where do you make the connection, or how do you get to the point of saying, okay, these gospels are in the same category as these mythologies?
the Gospels were historicized by people after the fact, um, to give it more credence, to give it more authority.
What
Um,
people, I guess, is my question.
um, I don't know exactly, but that's like the basic idea that I think, and I could be wrong about that.
Okay.
But
And
it seems like the
now,
Council of Nicaea,
so
I think
what?
that's the one. Council of Nicaea,
Okay, nice. Yeah.
uh, like they threw out a bunch of Gospels and
Yeah.
figured out the order and put it all together, and then
Okay.
stuff like that.
So, when I look at the Council of Nicaea, and I think a couple of things to be, aware of is that, when we talk about the historicizing of the Gospels, you have the Gospels written in a period of time in which, eyewitnesses are still around so that they can, uh, a system of checks and balances. And the reason I guess I would say that I don't necessarily believe that they're mythologies is because you have a primarily Jewish people whose problem, as we see in the Old Testament, is this idolatry, is this taking other people's stuff, and they're being punished for it, right? Whether you believe that or not, that's just kind of the way that we see that narrative play out in the Old Testament. The issues that Jesus addresses in the New Testament is, or the things that the Pharisees are worried about in the New Testament, the Jews in the New Testament, is not the adopting of other religions, but it's making sure that they are kept away. That's why they are discriminatory towards people like Samaritans, who are half breeds, who are Gentile and Jew. And so I think that when we call that a mythology, you'd have to make the connection and show that they adopted. You'd have to show, you know, historically that they adopted these things, from these ancient Near East religions, and then inserted those things, into Christianity. And what's interesting about that is because uh, guys like T.D. Mettinger, uh, you know, and even Greg Lloyd, or Greg, is it? I think it's Greg Boyd. Uh, they note that, as far as rising and dying God mythologies, those aren't around textually until after Christianity is already established.
Really?
And yeah, they say that these
No,
things,
there are no rising and dying God stories until
yeah,
after.
textually speaking, that those aren't around until after the gospel is already established. If you want afterwards, I will recommend you or show you the book. It's by Eddie and Boyd. I got it on my shelf, and they
Yeah.
show that those things aren't written down textually until
Yeah.
you don't get a rising and dying Osiris textually until after
All this,
Christian.
yeah, all this stuff is very interesting. Like, I really don't even know. I kind of don't even care exactly how it happened or how all this stuff happened. Like, they're fairly interesting stories to
Yeah,
me. It's just there are extraordinary claims with these stories that I see no way that we could justify believing in them,
yeah,
as far as I'm concerned. So, since I can't know them to be true, it doesn't really, like, as far as I can say is I don't know,
yeah,
and it just really doesn't matter that much to
yeah.
me.
Well, I mean, I'd like to, you know, I'm personally running out of time, but I'd like to, if it's okay, you know, follow up with you on some of those things. And to be honest, I appreciate the invitation for sure
Sure.
to come on and chat. And I would love to do it again if that's even in the realm of possibility in the future.
Yeah.
Because I'd like,
One of my friends in the chat would love to chat with you. Maybe if you're free later today or some other time.
well,
He's also really good.
it's 2 o'clock over there. It's 5 o'clock here.
Oh, okay.
So I'm on the East Coast, but I would love to chat, love to talk. Um, you know, so I appreciate you allowing me to come on here. I think it's great that you're doing this and that you allow people the opportunity to do that for sure, no doubt.
Yeah, I love hearing people out and hearing why they believe things. It's a lot of fun.
No problem, man. And I greatly appreciate it. Anything else you want to just comment real quick? I've got like 1 minute.
Sure, go ahead. Last word.
Um, you know, and the only other thing that I'd bring up is that on the Council of Nicaea by 325, it's not that they are pick and choosing books, but they are already affirming what has already been established and circulated in the first 2 centuries. That's the only thing that I would pick up. So, I'd love to talk more if that's possible in the future. And I just want to say, I really appreciate you inviting me and allowing me to do this. Appreciate it.
Sure thing. Yeah, I love the conversation. We'll have to do it again sometime.
All right, man. Take care.
All right. Thanks, guys, for watching.